For our final project for biomechanics, Kirk and I decided to analyze the situation you're about to watch in which a quarterback jumps over an oncoming defensive tackler. We chose this scenario to demonstrate 3 key biomechanics principles we thought were most valuable for anyone beginning this class or struggling to understand the concepts. 1. Pre-stretch and counter movement jump. 2. Projectile motion using jump height to find takeoff velocity. And 3. Bone tissue mechanics, where we will determine stress and strain during compression and analyze subsequent injury risk.
Now let's slow that down and highlight our first key concept, the pre-stretch effect in the counter movement jump. Pre-stretch is when a muscle is active and stretched before beginning to shorten. In other words, it is actively lengthened or eccentrically activated prior to contraction. Here you can see that prior to jumping upwards, I squatted quickly down. This is called a counter movement. In a counter movement, my knee extensor muscles, the quadriceps, are quickly stretched when I squat.
When the quadriceps are stretched, the cross bridges, which connect actin and myosin filaments of the muscle to produce muscle force, are also stretched. The muscle force that is produced during eccentric activation depends on how far the cross bridges are stretched. When the cross bridges are stretched, elastic energy is stored. This elastic energy can be used to produce a more forceful contraction. The cross bridges essentially act like springs.
This pre-stretch phase must occur quickly. The elastic energy stored will dissipate as heat if it is not returned to the system to produce the contractile muscle force to propel the jumper upwards. If I were to sit in a squat for a longer period of time before jumping up, the elastic energy gained during pre-stretch would be lost and I would not have been able to jump as high as I did.
Hopefully you now have a better understanding of why in most sporting activities that require a person to jump high, be it football, basketball, or volleyball, you often see the athletes use a counter movement to pre-stretch their muscles and produce greater force to jump higher.
Now that we have explained the purpose of a counter movement to produce this maximum force and jump height, we think it is important that we analyze this jump's projectile motion. By doing so, we can determine the takeoff velocity required of the quarterback in order to jump over the defender. The motion is purely vertical.
There are 3 key equations used to solve projectile motion problems. We will be using the third one to determine the takeoff velocity of the quarterback as he begins his jump over the defender. So now we just have to find the vertical displacement of the quarterback's center of mass from takeoff to peak jump height in order to calculate his takeoff velocity.
The quarterback sees the defender running at him in a crouched position at about half of his height. He estimates that he will get his feet about 0.95 meters off the ground to clear the defender. The quarterback's center of mass is 1 meter from the ground when he is standing straight up. By pulling his legs at the peak of his jump, he can get his feet about 0.55 meters from his center of mass. Therefore, in order to clear the oncoming defender, this jump has to vertically displace his center of mass at least 0.5 meters. Now we have all the information needed to calculate the quarterback's takeoff velocity. At the peak height of projectile motion, final velocity is equal to 0. Acceleration in projectile motion is due to gravity, so A equals negative 9.81 meters per second squared, and we just found the vertical displacement to be 0.5 meters.
This allows you to set the initial velocity squared equal to your calculated value. The last step is to take the square root of both sides of the equation to find the initial velocity, which is equal to 3.13 meters per second. Because this motion is purely vertical, there is no horizontal velocity component that needs to be accounted for. As part of the projectile motion analysis, we can also determine the quarterback's final landing velocity. Using the third equation again, we find that because the quarterback jumped straight up and down, his initial velocity is equal to his final velocity, so final velocity also equals 3.13 meters per second.
Now that we understand pre-stretch and projectile motion, it is important to analyze the quarterback's risk of injury during landing from this jump. In order to determine his risk of injury, we need to understand bone tissue mechanics. We will be calculating the average ground reaction force on a single lower leg of the quarterback to see if he's at risk of injury from this landing. Force equals mass times acceleration. The mass of the quarterback is 72.6 kilograms. We also know that acceleration is equal to change in velocity divided by the change in time. We can find delta t from the video. Delta t is the time from the moment of impact to when the quarterback's downward velocity is equal to 0. Therefore, delta t equals 0.165 seconds, and delta v equals 3.13 meters per second. So substituting in the known values, 72.6 kilograms, 3.13 meters per second, and 0.165 seconds, we find the ground reaction force to be 1,377.2 newtons. In order to isolate a single leg, we divide the force by 2, so that force on a single leg is equal to 688.6 newtons.
Now we can assess risk of injury by discussing stress and strain as they relate to bone loaded in compression. Stress equals force divided by cross-sectional area, while strain equals stress divided by elastic modulus of bone, which is a measure of stiffness. According to the article, muscle cross-sectional area and bone cross-sectional area in the human lower leg measured with peripheral computed tomography, the average cross-sectional area of the tibia and fibula combined for males is 4.4 times 10 to the negative fourth meters squared. So if we take the average force we just calculated for the landing for one leg, 688.6 newtons, and divide that by this cross-sectional area, 4.4 times 10 to the negative fourth meters squared, we find a compressive stress on the bones of a single lower leg during this landing equal to 1.57 megapascals.
The ultimate compressive stress of bone is 190 megapascals, so the stress imparted on the bones of the lower leg during this landing are not even close to the ultimate stress. There's very low risk of injury because the bones are strongest loaded under compression. Loading a bone in tension, or shear, results in a much lower ultimate stress, and therefore a higher risk of injury. The elastic modulus of bone is approximately 17 times 10 to the 9th pascals. So if we divide the stress we just calculated by the elastic modulus, we obtain a strain of 9.21 times 10 to the negative 5th. We find the strain percentage to be only 0.0092%. The ultimate strain of bone loaded in compression is 2.6%. So again, the strain on the bones of the lower leg during this landing are very far from causing injury.
Thank you for listening, and we hope you have found this instructional video helpful. Good luck in your studies.